Imagine a revolution that began with cries for liberty but ended with the sound of falling guillotines. The French Revolution promised freedom, yet its darkest days saw neighbors turning on neighbors and streets running red with blood. What started as idealism quickly spiraled into paranoia and mass executions. Tonight, we'll uncover the chilling reality behind the revolution's noble ideals, how fear, power struggles, and unchecked violence reshaped France forever. If you think you know the full story, prepare to be unsettled. Imagine a hot July morning in Paris. A crowd gathers outside the Bastille, not to celebrate freedom, but to seize gunpowder. They're desperate, hungry, and convinced the fortress holds the key to their survival. The Bastille isn't just a prison. It's a looming stone symbol of everything they despise. The governor, Bernard-René Delaunay, thinks he can reason with them. He's wrong. At first, the crowd seems almost orderly. They demand the fort's surrender, the release of prisoners, the weapons inside. Negotiations drag on for hours. But when the governor's men fire into the crowd, something snaps. The mob surges forward, fueled by rage and a sudden, collective realization. They outnumber the guards by hundreds. The drawbridge crashes down. What follows isn't liberation, it's carnage. The violence is methodical, almost ritualistic. The governor is dragged through the streets, stabbed, beaten, his head sawn off and mounted on a pike. A baker who defended the fort suffers the same fate. Prisoners are freed, yes, but only 7 remain inside, a fraction of the crowd's expectations. The gunpowder is taken, but the real prize is the act itself. The people have shattered royal authority with their bare hands. Psychologists would later call this moment a liminal threshold, the point where protest becomes bloodshed. The crowd isn't just angry, they've crossed into a new state of mind. The Bastille's fall teaches them 2 things. Violence works, and no one is coming to stop them. It's a lesson they'll remember in the months ahead. The aftermath is eerily quiet. People pick through the rubble, taking stones as souvenirs. The fortress that once symbolized oppression is now a ruin, its image etched into pamphlets and songs. But the revolution hasn't even begun. The storming of the Bastille is just the first spark in a fire that will consume France. Word spreads fast. In Versailles, King Louis XVI hears the news and asks, "Is this a revolt?" His advisor replies, "No, sire. It is a revolution. The distinction is crucial. Revolts can be crushed. Revolutions change everything." Meanwhile, in the countryside, rumors take root. If Paris can tear down the Bastille, what's stopping peasants from attacking their own oppressors? The answer, it turns out, is nothing at all. The great fear is coming. The storming of the Bastille didn't just topple a fortress. It shattered an illusion. For centuries, the monarchy had seemed unshakable. Now, in a single day, ordinary people learned they could break it. But breaking things is easy. Building something new, especially while soaked in blood, proves much harder. As the dust settles, Paris buzzes with uneasy energy. The National Assembly debates, the king hesitates, and the streets hum with suspicion. Who's next? The clergy? The nobles? The answer, in time, will be all of them. And then, of course, each other. The revolution has its martyr, its mythic moment. But myths are clean, and the Bastille was anything but. The severed heads, the makeshift spears, the bodies left in the summer heat. These details fade from the official story. What remains is the symbol, liberty rising from the rubble. Yet symbols don't bleed. People do. And France is just getting started. On a quiet night in rural France, a rumor could turn neighbor against neighbor. The storming of the Bastille had unleashed something unpredictable, a wildfire of paranoia that would soon engulf the countryside. They called it the Great Fear. Imagine walking through a village where every shadow might hide an aristocrat's revenge. Word spread that nobles were hiring outlaws to slaughter peasants before they could demand rights. There was no proof, no organized plot, just the gnawing certainty that the old order would strike back. In this climate, a single shouted warning at dusk could set an entire region aflame by dawn. The attacks followed a chilling pattern. Peasants armed with scythes and pitchforks surrounded manor houses, demanding the feudal records that bound them to generations of servitude. When these parchment chains were thrown into bonfires, the flames sometimes spread to the homes themselves. Some landlords barely escaped with their lives, watched by crowds shouting new revolutionary slogans over the crackling of burning property deeds. What's remarkable isn't just the violence, but how swiftly it moved. In late July 1789, the panic spread across nearly every province in under 2 weeks, faster than any rider could carry news. Historians estimate over 150 separate disturbances erupted during those sweltering summer nights. The terror fed on itself, with each new report of imaginary brigands justifying preemptive strikes against real aristocrats. The psychological shift was profound. For centuries, peasants had accepted their place in the rigid social order. Now they acted as if the entire system could vanish in a puff of smoke along with those burning documents. One moment they were subjects, the next they were tearing down symbols of oppression with their bare hands. The violence wasn't organized revolution. It was something more primal, like animals chewing off a trapped limb. Consider what happened in the Dauphiné region. A rumor spread that nobles were poisoning wells, so villagers dragged a local landowner to his own fountain and forced him to drink. When he didn't die, they beat him anyway as punishment for his plots. Such incidents reveal how fear had twisted reality itself. Every event became proof of conspiracy, every denial evidence of cunning deception. The revolution's leaders in Paris watched this rural uprising with mixed feelings. Their new government needed popular support, but couldn't endorse outright anarchy. By August, they made a calculated decision. They would legalize the peasants' demands while condemning the methods. The National Assembly abolished feudal privileges in a single dramatic session, effectively pardoning the violence by making its goals law. Yet the Great Fear left scars no decree could heal. It proved how quickly authority could evaporate when enough people stopped believing in it. The psychological boundary between protest and riot, between justice and vengeance, had been permanently blurred. As you'll see, this erosion of restraint would have consequences far beyond the countryside. Meanwhile, in Paris, another kind of fear was taking hold, one that would make the rural panic seem almost quaint by comparison. The revolution's leaders began seeing enemies everywhere, and they had much more efficient methods for dealing with them than pitchforks and torches. What if I told you that Parisian prisons became slaughterhouses in the name of liberty? As summer faded into September 1792, fear gripped the revolutionary government. Prussia and Austria were advancing toward Paris, their armies threatening to crush the revolution. Inside the city walls, rumors spread that imprisoned aristocrats and clergy were plotting a massacre of patriots. The air smelled of panic and gunpowder. The killings began quietly enough. At the Abbey prison, a makeshift tribunal assembled in the courtyard. Prisoners were brought forward one by one, not for trial, but for theater. Guards hauled men before judges who asked perfunctory questions before nodding toward the exit. Outside waited men with pikes and sabers. The first victim was a priest who refused to swear loyalty to the revolution. His death took 30 blows. Consider the Swiss guards. These professional soldiers had defended the Tuileries Palace when the mob stormed it weeks earlier. Now those who survived the fighting sat imprisoned, easy targets. Their killers didn't bother with tribunals. Guards opened cell doors and stepped aside as crowds surged in with knives. The Swiss died where they slept, their elaborate uniforms soaked red in torchlight. The massacres weren't confined to political prisoners. At La Force prison, common thieves and murderers found themselves dragged before the same revolutionary justice as nobles. A teenage pickpocket died beside an aging countess. The criteria for execution kept shifting: wealth, profession, even accent could condemn a person. By the third day, killers grew tired and sloppy. Some victims survived initial attacks only to be finished off hours later in alleyways. Psychologists would recognize this escalation. Group violence follows patterns. The anonymity of crowds erodes restraint. The rhythm of repetition dulls revulsion. What began as selective killings became industrialized slaughter. Teams formed to handle the workflow. One group dispatched prisoners while another disposed of bodies in the Seine. Witnesses reported hearing steady thuds as corpses hit water throughout the night. The Princesse de Lamballe's fate illustrates the darkest impulses at play. Marie Antoinette's friend was paraded through streets before her killers debated how to display her remains. They settled on mounting her head outside the Queen's window. Such theatrical cruelty betrayed more than bloodlust. It revealed a need to transform violence into message. Death wasn't enough. Suffering required an audience. Numbers tell part of the story. Between 1,100 and 1,400 people died over 5 days, mostly in prisons like the Conciergerie and Bastille. But statistics can't capture the texture: how killers sometimes paused to share wine with onlookers, how neighborhood butchers supplied cleavers when blades grew dull, how children reportedly played games with discarded bones. Revolution had mutated into ritual. Europe reacted with horror. Even revolutionary allies recoiled at reports filtering across borders. The massacres provided perfect propaganda for monarchies claiming France had descended into anarchy. Within Paris itself, a disturbing realization set in. No one had ordered the killings, yet no one stopped them. The violence had its own momentum, feeding on fear and flourishing in the absence of restraint. What's chilling is how ordinary the perpetrators were. Shopkeepers, craftsmen, National Guardsmen, people who weeks earlier had been living quiet lives. The massacres demonstrated how quickly social norms dissolve when fear overrides morality. Like dominoes toppling, each act of violence made the next seem more acceptable until brutality became routine. The September massacres marked a watershed. Before them, revolutionary violence could be framed as regrettable necessity. Afterward, systematic killing became integral to governing. The massacres proved that crowds would accept extreme measures against perceived threats. Within months, this lesson would be formalized as state policy under the Reign of Terror. But the terror's mechanisms would differ in crucial ways. The September killers answered to no one. Their violence was spontaneous, chaotic. Future executions would be bureaucratized, authorized from above rather than surging from below. Guillotines would replace mobs, offering the illusion of order amid continuing bloodshed. The prison massacres left Paris physically and psychologically scarred. Streets near the killing sites remained deserted after dark. Former participants found themselves shunned by neighbors who cheered them days earlier. Even the revolution's leaders seemed unsettled by what they'd unleashed but failed to control. Perhaps most telling was how quickly the events were reframed. Within weeks, government newspapers described the massacres as unfortunate but necessary, unpleasant medicine for revolutionary survival. This narrative justification would become the template for all future atrocities. Violence portrayed not as breakdown, but as painful duty. As autumn leaves scattered across blood-stained courtyards, Parisians faced difficult questions. Was this what revolution meant? Could liberty bloom from such poisoned soil? The answers would emerge in coming months as France spiraled further into darkness. One thing was certain after September: no one could claim ignorance about how far the revolution might go. The massacres had drawn a line in blood, proving that no principle, not justice, not mercy, was sacred when survival seemed at stake. Such revelations come with costs. Having glimpsed the abyss, Paris found it increasingly difficult to look away. Meanwhile, in makeshift offices across the city, a new group began consolidating power. They watched the chaos with quiet calculation, recognizing opportunity in the aftermath. Soon they would create a more orderly, more terrible machine of death, one that operated not in prison courtyards, but in the heart of government itself. Imagine a government that kills its own people to protect them. That was the logic of the Committee of Public Safety during the Reign of Terror. From 1793 to 1794, France operated like a machine, meticulously processing citizens through suspicion, judgment, and execution. The revolution had become its own kind of tyranny. The Committee of Public Safety started as an emergency government. Foreign armies threatened France's borders, rebellions simmered in the provinces, and Paris bristled with conspiracy theories. The 12 men who took control weren't bloodthirsty fanatics at first. They saw themselves as surgeons amputating infected limbs to save the body. The patient just happened to be an entire nation. They passed the Law of Suspects in September 1793. It allowed arrest for vague reasons, expressing doubt about the revolution, being related to an aristocrat, even staying quiet too often. The definition of enemy stretched daily. Soon prisons overflowed with people accused of crimes like insufficient revolutionary zeal or suspected sadness. Fear became the air people breathed. The Revolutionary Tribunal turned justice into theater. Trials averaged 15 minutes. Prosecutors presented no evidence, just declarations about protecting the Republic. Juries voted without leaving their seats. The guilty went straight to carts waiting outside. You could be eating breakfast at home, arrested by noon, tried at 2, and dead by sundown. The process was so predictable some victims brought their own execution clothes to court. Georges Danton learned this the hard way. Once a revolutionary hero who helped overthrow the king, he made the fatal mistake of suggesting the terror had gone far enough. His trial shocked even hardened revolutionaries. The prosecutor called Danton a rotten idol who needed removal. When Danton shouted down accusations, officials simply declared his outbursts proved guilt. His execution demonstrated no one was safe, not even those who built the revolution. The guillotine worked 6 days a week. It was efficient, a blade could drop 20 times an hour. Executioners kept tally marks on the wooden frame. Crowds initially cheered, then grew quiet, then stopped coming altogether. Officials worried about declining attendance, as if executions were theater reviews slipping in popularity. They needn't have worried. Fear kept people watching even when they looked away. Numbers hint at the scale, though they can't capture the dread. Between 16,000 and 17,000 official executions by guillotine. Maybe 10,000 more dying in overcrowded prisons from disease or beaten by guards. The killing wasn't confined to nobles, peasants, shopkeepers, even revolutionary soldiers faced the blade alongside them. Entire families sometimes went together, adults first, so children wouldn't be orphaned before arrival. Provincial cities saw some of the worst violence. In Lyon, officials demolished wealthy neighborhoods with cannon fire before executing hundreds near the ruins. Nantes used mass drownings in the Loire River called Republican baptisms. These weren't frenzied mobs, but organized operations run by government officials filing reports back to Paris. The revolution had bureaucratized bloodshed. Paris maintained grim rituals. Each morning, jailers read lists of those chosen for trial that day. Prisoners shared last meals if they had money for food or friends to bring it. At the conciergerie, officials called it the antechamber of death. Almost no one left except through the executioner's door. The sheer volume forced innovations: special carts designed to carry more prisoners, wider trenches dug for bodies at cemeteries. Fear reshaped daily life. Neighbors informed on each other for rewards or to deflect suspicion. Families destroyed letters and books that might look suspicious. People practiced facial expressions. Too much joy seemed suspect. Too much sadness even more so. The revolution demanded performance even in private moments. Survival meant reading the air constantly, like living inside a minefield. Robespierre became the figurehead of this system, though he rarely attended executions. He preferred writing speeches about virtue while others did the dirty work. His famous phrase, "Virtue without terror is powerless," captured the revolution's contradiction. How do you force people to be free? The answer appeared to be killing anyone who resisted the idea. The terror followed seasonal rhythms. Executions peaked in warmer months when travel was easier and crowds larger. Bad weather slowed but never stopped the machinery. Even heavy snow simply meant officials ordered more firewood for bystanders. The revolution waited for no one. When guillotines jammed, executioners used swords until repairs were made. By summer 1794, the terror began consuming itself. The trials accelerated from hundreds to thousands per month. Government clerks could barely keep records straight. Some victims were officially executed days after they died. Rumors spread that even the executioner might be next. In this atmosphere, fearing you might be suspected became reason enough to turn on others first. The system ultimately collapsed from its own weight. Revolutionary factions that once united against enemies now accused each other. When Robespierre finally faced arrest, he found the mechanisms he helped create worked just as efficiently against him. There was poetry in watching the architect of terror beg for his life before the tribunal he empowered. But the reign of terror left deeper scars than individual deaths, proved how quickly ideals could twist into nightmares. The revolution had promised liberty yet built a state where dissenting thoughts became capital crimes. It championed equality by making everyone equally disposable. The terror wasn't an accident. It was the logical endpoint of believing purity justifies any means. The guillotine blades would eventually dull from overuse. Prison gates would creak open for survivors. But something fundamental had changed in France. The revolution had revealed how thin the veneer of civilization really was. Once people accept that ends justify means, the means have a way of becoming the ends themselves. That realization would outlast the terror, lingering like smoke after fire. On a quiet night in Paris, the sound of a falling blade carried farther than you'd expect. The guillotine wasn't just an execution device. It was a carefully engineered solution to an Enlightenment problem. How do you kill people humanely while treating all citizens equally? The answer stood 12 feet tall in town squares across France. The irony was baked into its design. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine envisioned a machine that would make executions quick and equal. An aristocrat's neck would part as easily as a baker's. The slanted blade, weighing over 80 pounds, dropped at 21 feet per second. Engineers tested it on sheep first, then corpses. By the time it reached live prisoners, the mechanism had been perfected to decapitate within half a second. Death, at least in theory, became instant and painless. Louis XVI's execution revealed the guillotine's true nature. When the former king mounted the scaffold, the crowd expected defiance or pleading. Instead, they saw a middle-aged man confused by the instructions about where to place his head. The executioner had to guide him. Then the blade fell, and an assistant held the head up by the hair so everyone could see. What shocked observers wasn't the violence. Public executions were common, but the mechanical efficiency. Kings used to die differently. Privately, with dignity, perhaps by sword if absolutely necessary. Now they died like everyone else. The numbers tell part of the story. During peak periods, Paris's main guillotine could process 12 people per hour. Provincial versions were less polished. Some wobbled, others required multiple drops to sever the neck fully. But the principle held. This was death industrialized. Executioners became minor celebrities, their techniques debated like craftsmen's. One famous operator, Charles-Henri Sanson, performed nearly 3,000 executions but complained in letters about the emotional toll. Even he needed assistance when the blade got too slick with blood. What's often overlooked is the guillotine's psychological impact on spectators. Early crowds came for entertainment, bringing picnic lunches and applauding particularly clean cuts. But as executions became daily events, attendance dropped. The sound, a metallic whoosh followed by a wooden thud, could be heard blocks away even when you couldn't see the scaffold. People started noticing how heads still blinked for several seconds after separation. Scientists debated whether consciousness lingered, conducting macabre experiments where they shouted names at freshly severed heads. The guillotine also changed how victims prepared. Before, noble prisoners dressed plainly to avoid mocking crowds. Now, some chose elaborate outfits, a final act of defiance. One woman arranged her hair carefully so it wouldn't interfere with the blade's path. Another famously apologized for accidentally stepping on her executioner's foot. These small acts of dignity contrasted sharply with the machine's impersonal nature. It didn't care about your last words or how you arranged your collar. Cultural reactions were mixed. Artists depicted the guillotine in propaganda prints, sometimes as a just sword of the people, other times as a monstrous devourer of lives. Parents used it as a threat to misbehaving children. Entrepreneurs sold miniature replicas as souvenirs. The device seeped into language too. To look for the window meant scanning a crowd for the scaffold. Meanwhile, executioners reported that blood-soaked sand from beneath the device could cure warts. Reality and superstition blurred around this wooden frame. Marie Antoinette's execution demonstrated the guillotine's democratic cruelty. The former queen, now a haggard woman with whitened hair, rode to her death in an ordinary cart. Eyewitnesses noted she accidentally trod on the executioner's foot while climbing the steps and apologized. Her last words were lost in the crowd noise. The blade made no distinction between royalty and revolutionaries. Months later, those same revolutionary leaders would kneel at the same spot, learning too late that the machine they'd empowered showed no loyalty. The contradictions multiplied. This device meant to humanize execution made killing easier to stomach psychologically. The cleaner the method, the more abstract death became, allowing for greater numbers. Guillotines operated in 23 French cities during the Terror, their operators shipping replacement blades as stocks wore out. Some provincial models developed nicknames. The national razor in one town, the people's justice in another. The language softened the reality. These were factories processing human lives. Perhaps the strangest legacy was how the guillotine outlasted the revolution itself. France continued using it for nearly 2 more centuries, the blade dropping for the last time in 1977. The same mechanism that killed a king executed ordinary criminals well into the modern era. This persistence raises uncomfortable questions. How humane can any execution really be? And what does it say about a society that refined the mechanics of death while struggling to define justice? Look closely at contemporary drawings of the device, and you'll notice something peculiar. The guillotine wasn't painted red, as many imagine, but a dull sky blue, the same color used on hospital walls. This wasn't an accident. The designers genuinely believed they were creating something progressive, a medical solution to a social problem. In their minds, they were bringing enlightenment to the darkest act a state can perform. What they actually built was a perfect metaphor for revolutionary France itself. A machine that treated everyone equally while making horror routine. The guillotine promised painless equality, but delivered something more complicated. A system where morality could be suspended as long as the blade fell efficiently. Its shadow stretched far beyond the revolution, asking us how often humane intentions pave roads to brutality. Meanwhile, in churches across France, another kind of reckoning was unfolding. Revolutionaries weren't just remaking government, they sought to reinvent God himself. The new state religion would worship reason instead of saints, turning cathedrals into temples of logic. But faith, as they'd soon learn, doesn't disappear just because you declare it obsolete. What if I told you that churches were turned into temples of reason, their altars replaced with statues of liberty and their priests forced to choose between betrayal or death? In the autumn of 1793, the revolution took aim at one of France's oldest institutions, the Catholic Church. This wasn't just reform, it was eradication. The campaign began with the seizure of church properties, the stripping of gold and silver from cathedrals. But it quickly escalated into something darker. Priests were given an impossible choice: swear loyalty to the new regime and renounce their faith, or face the guillotine. Many refused. In rural areas, where faith ran deep, villagers hid their clergy in attics and cellars, risking their own lives to protect them. Paris became the stage for the revolution's most brazen act of sacrilege. On November 10th, Notre Dame Cathedral was renamed the Temple of Reason. They brought in an actress, dressed her in white, and seated her on a makeshift throne as the goddess of reason. The crowd cheered as hymns were replaced with revolutionary anthems. It was a calculated spectacle, meant to show that superstition had fallen to progress. But outside the cities, the plan unraveled. Peasants who had tolerated the revolution's excesses drew the line at this. For generations, their lives had been marked by church bells and sacraments. Birth, marriage, death, all tied to the rhythms of faith. Now, revolutionaries came to smash crosses and ban prayers. In some villages, they found Bibles nailed to doors in defiance. The backlash was swift. The Vade region rose in open revolt, its people willing to die for the right to keep their priests and traditions. Elsewhere, underground networks smuggled clergy to safety or held secret masses in barns and forests. The revolution had underestimated how deeply faith was woven into daily life. By 1794, even some revolutionaries began to question the campaign. The cult of reason, meant to unify, had only deepened divisions. When Robespierre introduced the Festival of the Supreme Being, an attempt to blend deism with revolutionary values, it was too late. The damage was done. Millions now saw the revolution as a force that destroyed without building, that took without giving. The dechristianization campaign left a quiet but lasting scar. Churches reopened, but attendance never fully recovered. Faith became a private matter, separate from public life, a divide that still echoes in France today. The revolutionaries had tried to erase centuries of tradition in months. In the end, they proved how deeply some roots grow. As the terror waned, another form of violence was already stirring, this time not from the state, but from its victims. The revolution had taught its people how to hate. Now, they would use those lessons against each other. Imagine a region that fought for its faith and paid the cruelest price. The Vade, a patchwork of farmland and villages in western France, became the revolution's darkest blind spot, a place where ideals cracked under the weight of atrocity. This wasn't just rebellion. It was wholesale slaughter disguised as progress. The spark came in 1793, when Paris ordered mass conscription. For Vendéan peasants, this was the last straw. They'd tolerated land reforms, watched churches be desecrated, but sending their sons to die for a godless government? That crossed a line. Farmers grabbed hunting rifles, women hid priests in root cellars, and within weeks, makeshift armies of tens of thousands marched under the Sacred Heart banner. Their goal wasn't complicated. Restore the king, protect their faith, survive. The revolution's response revealed its true face. Generals received orders to exterminate the rebels using any means necessary. Troops burned crops, poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock. Whole villages vanished in smoke. Soldiers reported stacking bodies like firewood. Not just fighters, but grandmothers, children, even livestock. The logic was chilling. Erase the Vade's ability to sustain life, and the rebellion dies with it. Nantes became ground zero for horror. Republican official Jean-Baptiste Carrier pioneered what he called Republican baptisms. Prisoners, men, women, teenagers, were stripped naked, tied together in pairs, and loaded onto barges. Soldiers then sank the boats mid-river. The Loire's currents carried corpses for miles. Witnesses described limbs snagging on docks, bodies bloating in the sun. Carrier's men joked about the efficiency. No bullets wasted, no graves dug, just water doing the work. Historians still argue whether this was genocide. The numbers tilt toward yes, perhaps 200,000 dead, a quarter of the Vade's population. But the method matters more than the tally. Revolutionary soldiers kept ledgers documenting cleansed villages. Surgeons experimented on prisoners, testing whether decapitated heads could still hear. One general bragged in dispatches about creating a desert no one could inhabit again. This wasn't collateral damage. It was policy. The violence had a peculiar rhythm. Soldiers would occupy a town, force locals to host feasts celebrating the Republic, then execute them mid-meal. In one church, troops replaced the crucifix with a guillotine, inviting parishioners to meet their new savior. Survivors spoke of soldiers playing cards with victims' belongings, betting coats against watches while blood dried on their boots. The cruelty had a performative edge, as if proving loyalty required ever more grotesque acts. Yet the Vade fought back with equal ferocity. Peasant armies, led by former artisans and retired soldiers, ambushed Republican columns in foggy marshes. They fought with scythes, pitchforks, stolen muskets, whatever could maim. At times, they won. A hilltop called Mont de Alouettes saw thousands of Republicans routed by farmers who knew every rabbit path. But victories were brief. Paris simply sent more men, more guns, more orders to burn. The aftermath was quieter but just as cruel. Survivors returned to fields salted with lime, homes reduced to charcoal. Many starved that winter, gnawing tree bark while Republican garrisons ate confiscated grain. The state banned mourning clothes. Grief itself became suspect. To speak of the dead risked arrest. To bury them properly meant midnight trips to hidden graves. The Vade became a place of whispers, where even children learned to lie about where they'd been last spring. Most chilling is how quickly France forgot. Official records called it pacification, not massacre. Textbooks praised the Republic's triumph over brigands. For 200 years, the Vade was a footnote if mentioned at all. Only in the 1980s did historians begin exhuming mass graves, tallying parish records, proving the scale of what happened. Even now, French schools teach little about it. Some wounds resist memorials. What does the Vade tell us? Perhaps that revolutions, like all human projects, carry their own blindness. The same Paris politicians who denounced tyranny became tyrants when challenged. The same ideals of liberty justified atrocities against those who desired different freedoms. The Vade wasn't an aberration. It was the revolution stripped bare, showing what happens when ideology trumps humanity. The survivors rebuilt, of course. They always do. Churches rose again, fields regrew, children were born. But walk those lanes today and you'll feel it still. The way certain meadows sag slightly where mass graves settle, how older villagers skirt certain topics. Memory lingers in the land, even when history looks away. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the terror reached its peak. Having crushed external threats, the revolution turned inward. The Committee of Public Safety, which orchestrated the Vade's destruction, now faced its own reckoning. Men who'd signed execution orders would soon kneel beneath the same blade. Violence, once unleashed, rarely stops where its masters intend. On a quiet night in July 1794, the man who had orchestrated thousands of executions found himself cornered. Maximilien Robespierre, architect of the terror, now faced the same fate he'd assigned to so many others. His downfall came not from the mobs in the streets, but from his own government, the very Committee of Public Safety he had used as an instrument of control. By that summer, Robespierre had become increasingly isolated. He saw enemies everywhere, even among his closest allies. His speeches grew more desperate, filled with vague warnings about traitors in their midst. When he addressed the convention on July 26th, he claimed to know of a new conspiracy but refused to name names. This was his fatal mistake. The unnamed conspirators realized they all might be next. The next day, the convention turned on him. Robespierre and his inner circle were declared outlaws, their immunity stripped away. His allies tried to rally support at the city hall, but the crowds didn't come. The people were exhausted, too drained by years of bloodshed to defend the man who had become the face of the terror. Accounts vary about what happened next in that chaotic night. Some say Robespierre tried to shoot himself. Others claim a gendarme's bullet struck him as they stormed the building. Either way, the wound shattered his jaw, leaving him unable to speak as his captors dragged him away. They carried Robespierre to the scaffold the following afternoon. The man who had signed thousands of death warrants now climbed the steps to the guillotine himself. The blade fell at the same steady pace he had maintained for months. No special treatment for the revolution's former leader. The Thermidorian reaction, as this overthrow came to be known, ended the reign of terror but couldn't end the violence. People celebrated in the streets, but they also began settling scores. Former supporters of the terror now found themselves hunted. Jacobin clubs were closed, their members driven into hiding. The revolution had reached a turning point no one had anticipated. The Committee of Public Safety lost its power. The law of suspects was repealed. But the machinery of fear didn't simply disappear. It just changed hands. New factions emerged, each accusing the others of being secret royalists or radical terrorists. In the months that followed, the guillotine continued its work, though at a slower pace. Many who had enforced the terror now became its victims. Others fled Paris, trying to blend into provincial towns where their names weren't known. The revolution had begun consuming its own children, as revolutions often do. The prisons that had overflowed during the terror gradually emptied, but not completely. New suspects replaced the old ones: government officials, businessmen, even playwrights found themselves answering for real or imagined crimes. The rules kept changing, making it impossible to know who might be safe. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens tried to rebuild their lives. Shops reopened. Theaters put on new plays. People began hosting salons again, though conversations remained guarded. Everyone had learned how quickly words could be twisted into evidence. The silence in these gatherings spoke volumes about the fear that lingered. Paris still bore the scars of its ordeal. Empty chairs at dinner tables, closed workshops where proprietors had vanished, children who no longer asked about missing parents. The city moved forward, but the terror had left a mark that wouldn't fade quickly. The Thermidorians who took control promised stability, but they faced impossible challenges. Food shortages continued. Inflation ruined family savings, and the war with foreign powers dragged on, draining resources and lives. They abolished the revolutionary calendar, yet time itself felt fractured. In the countryside, reactions were mixed. Some villages celebrated Robespierre's fall. Others remained loyal to radical ideals. Still more simply wanted to be left alone after years of turmoil. The revolution's momentum had stalled, but no clear path forward emerged. The guillotine that had worked so efficiently now stood as a warning to any who might try to revive the terror. Its shadow stretched long over the new government's proceedings. Every official knew it could as easily claim them as it had their predecessors. Robespierre's legacy became a cautionary tale about absolute power. The man who had preached virtue had become a tyrant. His insistence on purity had led to endless bloodshed. Even his closest allies abandoned him when they saw where his vision led. Yet the ideals he championed didn't disappear. Liberty, equality, fraternity remained powerful words, however tarnished by their association with the terror. The challenge now was finding a way to achieve them without the scaffolds and denunciations. As summer turned to fall, Paris held its breath. The Thermidorians struggled to govern without resorting to the methods they had condemned. Former radicals moderated their views. Former moderates regained some influence. The pendulum had begun its swing back, but no one knew where it would stop. What if I told you that the victims of the terror became killers themselves? After Robespierre fell, France didn't settle into peace. Instead, a new wave of violence erupted, this time targeting the very revolutionaries who had once wielded the guillotine. The White Terror was revenge in its rawest form, a bitter countercurrent to the bloodshed that came before. The Thermidorian reaction had ended the reign of terror, but it didn't end the killing. Former Jacobins, now defenseless, found themselves hunted by royalists, grieving families, and anyone who had suffered under the Committee of Public Safety. In cities like Lyon, the reckoning was especially brutal. Gangs of young royalists, known as muscadins, roamed the streets armed with clubs and knives. They dragged former officials from their homes, beating them in public squares or leaving their bodies in alleyways. The prisons, once filled with supposed enemies of the revolution, now held the revolutionaries themselves. Lyon became a grim stage for the White Terror's violence. The city had suffered terribly under the Jacobins. Mass executions, burned buildings, reprisals that left scars. Now the tables turned. Mobs stormed the prisons, hauling out former revolutionaries and killing them without trials. Some were shot in courtyards. Others were thrown into the Rhone River, their bodies left to drift downstream. The authorities, weak and divided, did little to stop it. In many cases, they encouraged it, turning a blind eye to the chaos. This wasn't justice. It was raw vengeance, a cycle of blood answering blood. Families who had lost loved ones to the guillotine now took their revenge on those they blamed. The White Terror spread like a fever, with massacres flaring across southern France where royalist sentiment still burned. Students, shopkeepers, even minor officials who had once enforced revolutionary laws were suddenly at risk. Fear shifted direction. Where once it had been the radicals who ruled with terror, now it was their turn to hide. The government, fragile and exhausted, could do little to control it. The Thermidorian Convention tried to restore order, issuing decrees and setting up courts. But they were too weak, too compromised. Some officials still sympathized with the revolutionaries. Others quietly supported the backlash. The result was confusion. Laws ignored, trials delayed, killers walking free. The violence became a settling of scores, not just politics but personal hatreds unleashed. In the countryside, the White Terror took different forms. Bands of armed men, some royalist, some just hungry for revenge, attacked former Jacobin strongholds. Rural towns that had supported the revolution now saw their leaders dragged from their homes. The terror's victims had been nameless crowds. The White Terror was more intimate. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges played out with knives and muskets. The most chilling part? Many who carried out the killings had once been victims themselves. Sons of the executed, widows of the guillotined. They saw their violence as justice, as payback for what they'd lost. But it wasn't justice. It was the same cycle repeating, just with new hands on the knives. The revolution had promised order through terror, but the terror had never ended. It had only shifted targets. The White Terror proved how deeply violence had corrupted the revolution. No ideology survived it unbroken. The Jacobins had killed in the name of liberty. Now their enemies killed in the name of revenge. The revolution's lofty ideals, justice, equality, fraternity, were buried under the weight of bloodshed. The Thermidorians had hoped to stabilize France, but the White Terror made that impossible. Every lynching, every massacre pushed the country further from peace. And in the end, this chaos paved the way for Napoleon. The Directory, struggling to govern, faced revolts from both left and right. The White Terror had weakened trust in any form of government, leaving people desperate for stability, even if it meant trading liberty for a strongman's rule. The White Terror is often overlooked in the story of the revolution, but it shouldn't be. It shows what happens when violence becomes the only language people remember. When every grievance is settled with blood, no one is safe, not even the executioners. Imagine a government so corrupt that people started longing for the days of monarchy. That was the Directory, the revolutionary regime that replaced the terror, only to become mired in greed, instability, and military dependence. It rose in 1795 with promises of moderation, but quickly became a byword for dysfunction. The Directory's problems began immediately. Instead of revolutionary radicals, power now belonged to wealthy speculators and politicians who enriched themselves at public expense. Government contracts went to friends at inflated prices. Military suppliers delivered shoddy boots and rotten food while pocketing state funds. Ordinary citizens watched as inflation ravaged their savings, while the politically connected grew rich. Financial scandals became routine. One infamous case involved contractors supplying moldy grain to troops while charging for premium quality. Another saw officials embezzling funds meant for naval repairs. The irony was hard to miss. The revolution had begun partly over bread shortages, yet now its own leaders profited from starvation. Corruption wasn't just tolerated. It became the system. Economic chaos deepened the crisis. The Directory printed money recklessly, causing hyperinflation. A loaf of bread that cost 1 franc in 1795 might cost 100 by 1796. Wages couldn't keep pace. Workers rioted. Farmers hoarded crops rather than sell for worthless paper. The government responded with half measures and more borrowing, digging the hole deeper. Political instability made everything worse. The Directory faced threats from both sides: Jacobins plotting a return to radical rule, Royalists scheming to restore the monarchy. To survive, it staged coups against its own legislature twice in 4 years. Each crackdown weakened its legitimacy further. The government meant to stabilize France couldn't even stabilize itself. The military became the Directory's crutch and its undoing. Generals gained extraordinary power, putting down revolts and fighting foreign wars. Troops were sent to collect taxes when officials couldn't. Armies became self-sufficient, living off conquered territories rather than relying on the crumbling French economy. Soldiers increasingly saw their leaders in Paris as useless, looking instead to their commanders for direction. Napoleon Bonaparte thrived in this environment. The young general was sent to conquer Italy not just to defeat Austria, but to keep him away from Paris. Instead, he returned a hero with wealth seized from abroad and ambition to match. The Directory, desperate for popular support, celebrated his victories even as he overshadowed them. Public disillusionment grew unbearable. Cafes buzzed with jokes about the 5 kings of the Directory's ruling council. Newspapers mocked their incompetence. Ordinary citizens, exhausted by years of upheaval, began to view strong military rule as preferable to endless corruption. The Directory had promised balance after the Terror's extremism, but delivered only paralysis. Foreign policy was another disaster. Despite victories like Napoleon's Italian campaign, France remained at war with Britain, Austria, and others. The Directory vacillated between aggression and diplomacy, satisfying no one. Peace treaties were signed and broken. Alliances shifted unpredictably. By 1799, France was internationally isolated while still fighting multiple fronts. The bureaucracy became a maze of inefficiency. Paperwork piled up unresolved. Judges took bribes to delay cases. Local officials ignored directives from Paris. Government meetings descended into shouting matches. The revolution had promised to sweep away old inefficiencies, but the Directory created new ones, equally bad, just with different names. Cultural life suffered too. Theaters staged bland comedies afraid to offend. Artists fled abroad or stopped working. Intellectuals who had championed the revolution now avoided politics altogether. Even the once vibrant revolutionary festivals felt hollow, staged by officials going through the motions. France had traded ideological fervor for cynical graft. Military dependence reached a breaking point in 1799. When the Directory faced another crisis, threatened by royalists and radicals alike, it turned to Napoleon for help. They thought they could control him. They were wrong. His coup on 18 Brumaire wasn't just the Directory's end. It was the inevitable conclusion of years where real power had already shifted to the army. The Directory's failure was comprehensive. It didn't solve economic woes, establish political stability, or secure lasting peace. Its corruption alienated the public. Its reliance on the military created the very strongman it feared. In trying to avoid the terror's excesses, it became everything the revolution had originally opposed. Ineffective, self-serving, and disconnected from ordinary lives. Napoleon's rise wasn't an accident. It was the natural outcome of a system where incompetence made authoritarianism seem like salvation. Soldiers were tired of unpaid wages. Peasants wanted stable prices. Merchants craved predictable laws. The Directory provided none of this, only the illusion of calm before another storm. The tragedy is how avoidable it all was. With honest governance, economic reform, and genuine compromise, the Directory might have stabilized France. Instead, its leaders lined their pockets while the country crumbled. They became caricatures of the corrupt aristocrats the revolution had executed. As 1799 ended, few mourned the Directory's passing. Its leaders slipped quietly into obscurity. The public, traumatized by a decade of chaos, barely reacted. After constitutional monarchies, terror, and corruption, many simply wanted order, whatever the cost. Napoleon understood this longing perfectly. He didn't seize power so much as stroll into the vacuum the Directory created. The revolution had come full circle, from overthrowing absolute rule to embracing it again, just with a different face. The Directory's greatest legacy wasn't what it achieved, but what its failures made inevitable. The stage was now set for empire. A young general who had once been an outsider stood ready to rewrite France's story entirely. But that's another chapter, one where revolution gives way to something older and darker. The age of kings was over. The age of the emperor was about to begin. On a quiet night in November 1799, a young general ended the revolution with nothing more than a whisper. Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh from his military successes abroad, returned to a France exhausted by a decade of turmoil. The people had grown tired of the Directory's corruption, the constant political infighting, and the lingering shadow of terror. What they wanted now was order, and Napoleon knew exactly how to promise it. The coup began with careful planning. Napoleon and his allies spread rumors of a Jacobin plot, a convenient excuse to justify their actions. Soldiers loyal to him took control of key points in Paris, while members of the Directory were pressured to resign. The legislative councils, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, were moved to St. Cloud, a strategic move that isolated them from potential supporters in the city. Everything was designed to look like a necessary measure, a transfer of power rather than an outright takeover. But the transition wasn't as smooth as Napoleon hoped. When he entered the chambers at St. Cloud, he faced resistance. Some deputies accused him of wanting to be a dictator, shouting him down as he tried to speak. For a moment, it seemed the coup might fail. Then his brother Lucien, president of the Council of 500, stepped in. He called in the troops. Soldiers marched into the chamber, their boots loud on the wooden floors. The dissenting deputies were forced out at bayonet point, their protests drowned in the noise of shifting muskets and shouted orders. By nightfall, it was over. The Directory was finished. In its place stood the consulate, a new government with 3 leaders, at least on paper. In reality, Napoleon held all the power as first consul. The revolution, which had begun with dreams of liberty, had now placed its fate in the hands of one man. The people, too weary to protest, accepted the change. After years of bloodshed and instability, they wanted peace more than principles. Napoleon wasted no time. He drafted a new constitution that gave him sweeping authority, then moved to secure his position. Newspapers were censored, political enemies arrested, and any hint of opposition crushed. The secret police, a tool inherited from the terror, became his eyes and ears. He promised stability, and in exchange, the French people let him redefine the revolution's ideals. Liberty and equality still existed, but only as far as he allowed. The speed of his rise was staggering. Within years, he would crown himself emperor, the revolution's most vocal critics now bowing before him. The same men who had once condemned monarchy cheered as he took the throne. The revolution had devoured its own children, and in the end, it had produced not a republic but an empire. The ideals of 1789 were still there, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and military grandeur, but they no longer ruled. What began with the storming of the Bastille ended in the hushed halls of St. Cloud. The revolution, so fierce in its promise, had spent itself. In its place stood a soldier who understood power better than democracy. The people had traded chaos for control, and history would never be the same. And yet, the revolution's legacy wasn't entirely lost. Even under Napoleon, its reforms endured: the end of feudal privileges, the spread of secular education, the idea that merit mattered more than birth. But these victories came at a cost. The revolution had given France a new world, but it had also shown how quickly liberty could slip away in the name of order. Napoleon's rise was not just the end of an era. It was a warning of what happens when revolutions lose their way. The crowds that once chanted for freedom now marched under imperial banners. The streets that had run with blood were now lined with soldiers. The revolution had promised to change everything, and in the end, it had. Just not in the way anyone expected. Meanwhile, across Europe, the echoes of Napoleon's rise sent nations scrambling. Kings and emperors watched, uneasy, as France's experiment with democracy gave way to militarized ambition. The revolution had reshaped the continent once. Now, a new chapter was beginning, one led not by ideals, but by the man who had outlasted them all. What if I told you the French Revolution's brightest ideals cast the darkest shadows? The echoes of liberty, equality, and fraternity still reverberate through history, but so do the screams from the Place de la Grève. This contradiction lies at the heart of the revolution's legacy, a tension between aspiration and atrocity that continues to shape how we understand political change. Take the Napoleonic Code, perhaps the revolution's most enduring legal creation. It promised equality before the law, abolishing feudal privileges and establishing secular governance. Yet this same code reinforced patriarchal control, giving husbands authority over wives and restricting workers' rights to organize. The document embodies the revolution's paradox: progressive ideals filtered through authoritarian structures. Napoleon used it to cement his rule, proving how easily Enlightenment principles could serve autocracy. Europe felt this duality acutely. The revolution's ideals inspired liberation movements from Poland to Haiti, its slogans chanted by rebels and reformers across continents. But it also triggered decades of war as monarchies fought to contain its influence. The same principles that dissolved ancient hierarchies became justification for French imperialism under Napoleon. Liberation for some meant occupation for others, a pattern repeating as revolutionary armies marched across borders. The Vade Revolt demonstrates how quickly ideals could curdle into horror. When rural peasants resisted conscription and anti-clerical policies, the revolutionary government responded with extermination campaigns. Drownings, mass shootings, and scorched earth tactics killed hundreds of thousands, a brutality that modern scholars debate as potential genocide. Here, the revolution's universalist ideals fractured against regional loyalties and faith, revealing how abstract principles can justify concrete atrocities when dissent isn't tolerated. Thermidor and its aftermath exposed another uncomfortable truth. Revolutions often consume their architects. Robespierre's fall didn't end violence, it redirected it. The White Terror saw former Jacobins hunted by royalists in a grisly inversion of the Reign of Terror. This cyclical violence suggested something disturbing about human nature. Once bloodshed becomes an acceptable political tool, it rarely stays contained within ideological lines. The revolution's promise of fraternity withered when citizens learned to view each other as existential threats. Yet its institutional failures may be most revealing. The Directory's corruption showed how quickly revolutionary purity could decay into self-interest. Officials who had denounced aristocratic privilege now lined their pockets while inflation devastated ordinary citizens. The government's reliance on military force foreshadowed Napoleon's rise, proving Tocqueville's later observation that revolutions often strengthen the centralized power they meant to dismantle. Napoleon's coup wasn't an aberration, it was the logical endpoint of this erosion. France traded revolutionary chaos for imperial order, exchanging the idealism of 1789 for the efficiency of authoritarian rule. Interestingly, many citizens welcomed this shift. After years of instability, predictability mattered more than principles. The revolution had promised self-governance but delivered a lesson about human priorities. Safety often trumps liberty when forced to choose. Historians still debate whether the violence was necessary. Some argue the terror defended the revolution from external threats and internal sabotage. Others see it as the original sin that corrupted everything that followed, proof that noble ends don't justify monstrous means. The revolution's defenders point to abolished feudal dues and emerging democratic ideals. Its critics highlight the millions dead in resulting wars and purges. Perhaps the most telling comparison lies across the Atlantic. The American Revolution, occurring just years earlier, maintained greater stability despite similar Enlightenment influences. Key differences emerge. America's focus on negative liberties, freedom from interference, versus France's positive liberties, freedom to transform society, the presence of an ocean buffer against foreign intervention, and importantly, the absence of a comprehensive social revolution alongside the political one. France attempted both simultaneously, a recipe for volatility. The revolution's cultural impact reveals another layer. It birthed modern political vocabulary. Left and right terrorism as a concept, secular nationalism, while also demonstrating how quickly language could weaponize. Terms like counter-revolutionary became blank checks for persecution. Yet it also produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a document whose influence ripples through modern human rights frameworks. Oppressors and liberators alike have quoted its phrases, a testament to how malleable revolutionary rhetoric can be. Modern revolutions still grapple with these contradictions. From Russia in 1917 to Iran in 1979, the pattern repeats. Initial idealism giving way to consolidation of power, universal promises narrowing into partisan enforcement. The French Revolution serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale, a reminder that political change operates on a spectrum between transformation and tyranny. Its physical remnants tell the story. The Pantheon, originally a church-turned-temple of reason, now houses revolutionaries and conservatives alike. The Place de la Concorde, site of Louis XVI's execution, later witnessed the deaths of Robespierre and his allies. These spaces embody the revolution's cyclical nature, where yesterday's executioners become today's victims. The deeper legacy may be psychological. The revolution normalized the idea that societies could reinvent themselves entirely, an intoxicating but dangerous notion. It challenged divine right and aristocratic privilege, but also unleashed the concept of the enemy within, justifying surveillance states and preemptive repression. We still live with these tensions, between security and freedom, between majority rule and minority rights, between revolutionary upheaval and gradual reform. Most haunting is how ordinary people navigated these shifts. Diaries from the period show citizens adapting language like political weather vanes, one day praising Robespierre, the next celebrating his fall. This wasn't just survival instinct. It reflected how thoroughly the revolution reshaped consciousness. People learned to perform loyalty while privately doubting, a duality familiar to any modern society that's experienced rapid ideological change. The revolution's ultimate tragedy may be its failure of imagination. It sought to build a new world but couldn't escape old patterns of power. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame, the same cathedral where revolutionaries had staged their festival of reason. The symbolism was inescapable. The revolution had circled back to monarchy, albeit in different dress. Yet its incomplete promises still resonate. The unfinished business of 1789, true equality, substantive democracy, the tension between individual and collective rights, remains our business today. The revolution's shadow stretches across contemporary debates about wealth inequality, secularism, and state violence. It asks us whether societies can change profoundly without replicating the injustices they seek to replace. As you walk Paris's streets today, the revolution feels both vivid and distant. Its phrases adorn government buildings. Its scars linger in unmarked graves. The contradictions endure because they're human, our capacity for idealism and brutality, our yearning for change amid fear of chaos. The revolution didn't just reshape France. It held up a mirror to political transformation everywhere, reflecting both our highest hopes and our darkest capacities. In that sense, it never really ended. We're still living through its unresolved questions. Meanwhile, the stones of the Bastille survive in unexpected places. Workers repurposed them as building material after the fortress fell, embedding fragments across the city. You might pass one without knowing, revolutionary debris woven into quiet streets. It's an apt metaphor for the revolution itself. Broken but never fully erased, its remnants scattered through our modern world. The French Revolution remains history's great paradox, a struggle for liberty that drowned in blood. It began with soaring ideals but revealed how quickly purity spirals into purges. The Terror's 17,000 official executions remind us. Revolutions often consume their children, yet its legacy endures in our modern world. The clash between rights and order, the cost of radical change, the fragility of democracy when fear takes hold. Those prison cries and whispered doubts echo in today's political upheavals. So consider this: do ends ever justify such means? And when we demand justice, how do we avoid becoming what we overthrew? Subscribe for more explorations of history's haunting questions.